Yeah, that's a good question. I think everyone could maybe hear it, I think. No. He was asking about are Homo sapiens responsible for the what some people refer to as the sixth extinction, which is the reference to the other 5 extinction events, major extinction events in the past, one of which was the end Cretaceous one that I mentioned specifically on the first lecture. And I'm not going to really answer that now, because that's going to be the topic of actually tomorrow's and Friday's lectures. Tomorrow's will focus more on the impact of Homo sapiens in their migration through the world and the impacts they had. And yes, I do believe they are associated with many megafauna mass extinctions. And the second part about the sixth extinction and global warming, I think you referred to, that'll be in the last lecture. So if you can just sit tight on that. Yeah, up there, yeah. Yeah.
When was language acquired?
When was?
Language.
Oh, okay, that's a very good question. It's a very good question because it's very difficult to answer. It's difficult to answer because, as you can imagine, language obviously doesn't preserve very well. I didn't present it in these lectures. I do discuss it a bit in my book in chapter 3, or maybe it's chapter 4, actually, chapter 4. And we can look at certain aspects of the skull and the muscle attachments for the tongue and all these things and the position of the various bones and so forth, and can give some indication of when perhaps the musculature, because when we speak, we actually use a lot of our muscles in our tongue and our mouth to produce the sounds. Also aspects of our throat and our larynx and our voice box. So there are ways at which we can estimate when members of our lineage would have been capable of speech, whether they were speaking, whether it was syntactically like we do, or whether it was grunting like you see in those bad prehistoric movies. I don't know. It's very hard to know. But for me, I believe by Homo erectus, and certainly by Homo heidelbergensis, that speech must have been a part of their lives, because it's very difficult to imagine how they made and used the tools they did, lived communally the way they did, and hunted the way they did without some form of verbal communication. But exactly what that was, I'm not sure. So it's a very difficult question. Yes. Okay, I think we'll go, if other questions, just maybe wait till the end of this lecture, but let's get started. So yesterday with lecture 2, the main point I tried to make was that if you look at the skeletons of Homo erectus, shown here on the left, and Homo sapiens there next to it, this is the Turkana boy, one of the famous, fairly complete skeletons of Homo erectus. I think you can appreciate that in many respects, the overall bodies were similar. And what I tried to emphasize yesterday was that what changed primarily is you can see that the skull changed quite dramatically from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. And not just in the size of the endocast of the brain, but also in terms of the jaw and teeth and see how flat our face is compared to Homo erectus. So Homo erectus was an extremely successful species. And in fact, of all the Homo species, it has had the longest track record by far. So it was extremely well adapted and successful species. It was the first of our lineage to go global and into Eurasia. They didn't make it to Australia, as far as we know, or South or North America, but they did go global into Eurasia. So what I tried to emphasize yesterday was, why would you change that? Why would Homo erectus evolve into something else? And in particular, why would they have evolved towards Homo sapiens, us? And what I said there was that it was largely, ultimately related to this these highly variable climatic cycles, that the Earth's climate system shifted fundamentally approximately about 1 million years ago with the intensification of northern hemisphere glaciation events. And with that intensification came a far more variable climate, far more seasonal in its character. And this meant that at times, at least, not always, but at times, living was very hard. And so it required that Homo erectus and then Homo heidelbergensis and our predecessor make pretty fundamental changes in either their behavior or in innovative new tools or ways of extracting more food to allow them to survive. So that's what we tried to, main points I tried to get across yesterday. And what I want to do today is talk about us now, Homo sapiens, okay? And more specifically, how can we understand this final step? Well, and it's not necessarily the end, right? We're all going to be replaced by artificial intelligent robots, as we know. But until that happens, we're the end of the line. As I said, we're the only Homo species that endures today, even though 50,000 short years ago, there were as many as 5 possibly in the world. We're the only ones living currently, and we're certainly the ones that have had the biggest impact on the world. And what is distinctive about us, as I mentioned earlier, is our skull. And these are various images from an infant skull to adult skulls of bald men, so you can see the shape of their heads. And these are various, this is a medical scan. And actually there you can see the hyoid bone. That was what I was trying to remember earlier about voice. We have a hyoid bone near our larynx there. And that's also a little piece of evidence around language, although not a very strong one. Here's a modern skull. See that very flat face, very distinctive of humans, of Homo sapiens, and also this very bulbous skull, especially that forehead. You know, we all, even as infants, you know, we have these very big foreheads, and of course that's housing this large brain of ours with a large prefrontal cortex, and that's important in terms of how we think and how we go about our lives. So what I want to try to do today is talk specifically about the origin of our species. And this title is African Cradle: When, Where, and How Did Our Species Evolve? I call it African Cradle because it all happened in Africa. But remember, Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis had already left Africa. Now, presumably, Homo heidelbergensis replaced almost all of Homo erectus that still remained in Eurasia. So at some stage, you had a world split with Homo heidelbergensis in Africa and those in Eurasia. So someone could argue, and some have argued, why not have Homo sapiens evolve in Eurasia, and then they came back into Africa? Okay, that's another alternative. But the consensus and all the data to date, and I'll present quite a bit of that today, clearly, I think, shows that it wasn't in Eurasia that Homo sapiens evolved. It was clearly in Africa, and that Homo sapiens from Africa then left as the third pulse. Okay, so Homo erectus did it first, then Homo heidelbergensis, and then Homo sapiens did it. Our predecessor species doesn't appear to have done it, but Homo sapiens, certainly we did at a number of stages, migrate into Eurasia. Now, what I will emphasize, besides the fact that it's the African cradle, is I will argue that geographical isolation was very important in terms of our origin as a species, and that specifically, as I mentioned at the end of yesterday, the discovery of those groups that were geographically isolated the discovery of seafood and the regular adaptation of it in their diet played a very big role, I believe, in terms of our speciation. But those are fairly speculative, but I will go over them. Let's start with perhaps the most straightforward of these three, of when, where, and how. Let's start with when. Because as I mentioned, we have now more fossils, they're better dated. So the more straightforward question to address is when. And we can address when we appeared based on fossil skulls, like this one from, these are from Ethiopia, the Omo 1, Omo 2, and Herto skull. You can see the Herto in particular is a beautiful skull that has beautiful preservation. Unfortunately, Omo 1 and 2 are not as complete. They're also more difficult to date in terms of their deposits that they occur within. But Herto is a very beautiful skull, and it's well dated. And these ones below are somewhat younger, and they represent Homo sapiens that had moved into Israel, into the Levant, and they come from cave sites in Israel, the Kafez 9 and 11. And 11, these are also beautifully preserved skulls. So the when part comes from basically looking in the fossil record for when we first see what we refer to as anatomically modern humans. And anatomically modern, we mean when did their skull have this very typical bulbous shape that ours has, and we have a chin. That's another feature of our species. And we can look for fossils that give those anatomical features that are more or less the same as our own. But it's complicated, and the experts argue quite a lot about the interpretation, such that you may remember that I showed you a slide of some of the precursor species to us, the Latoli, the Florisbod, and the Jebel Arud skulls. Now, some would argue that those have features fairly close to our own, but most, I think, would agree that those are not quite Homo sapien. Some would even argue that these are not quite Homo sapien either, whereas many would suggest that these ones from Israel are. So it's debated by specialists, but I think what we can say is that sometime between, say, roughly 200 and, say, 120,000 years ago, our species, as far as anatomically, people that anatomically looked more or less like we do, are within the range of what we look like, because let's face it, some of us have a more prominent chin than others, some of us have a bigger forehead than others. We vary ourselves, right? As a population, there's quite a bit of variation among individuals. That's another problem, because we obviously don't have thousands of these to compare. We're lucky if we have one or two. So it does become statistically difficult to really address, whether these are strictly within the range of modern human variation, but they appear to be. So within East Africa, Ethiopia region, we have these fossils that suggest, and I would tend to pin it down closer to sort of this 170 to 150,000 year range. But I think in all fairness, we don't know it well enough, but we can pin it down to say between 200 and 120,000 years ago, the first members of our species that could be anatomically within the range of modern humans arrived or have been found in Africa and just outside Africa, because I'll mention that exodus a little bit later, that early exodus into the Levant. So if we put a red box there around that time, remember that this is the climatic cycles. And what I emphasized yesterday, and I'll emphasize here again in this lecture, is the importance of these climatic cycles. And just so that you appreciate what these curves are, I'm just going to repeat again slightly. These low points This represents when sea level was 120, 130 meters lower around the entire world. And the reason sea level was that much lower was because all that water had evaporated and gone into forming the ice sheets in the northern hemisphere. That's why sea level was so much lower, and that's what we call a glacial maximum. And the most recent one was back here at about 20,000 years ago, when sea level was at that very low level, and the world was a much colder, drier place. And what you can see is that in this interval between Homo heidelbergensis, appearing sometime in between this interval here, our predecessor, and then our speciation, we can see that there are a lot of these large-scale fluctuations in climate from these low sea levels of glacial periods to these relatively high sea levels comparable to today, when the northern ice sheets had mostly melted and sea level rose back up to its current position. So that's the context within these climate cycles, and I believe these climate cycles played an important role, and you'll see why as we go along. Because we can now address the question, if we think we can bracket approximately when our species appeared for the first time, let's try to answer now where in Africa this might have happened. Now, to answer that question, we need to understand a little bit about where species come from or how they come about, if we're going to try to think about where in Africa our species may come from. And so I'm just going to present you, in fact, we don't really understand how speciation events occur. In other words, how a new species actually comes about. There's lots of ideas, but I just want to give you some general concepts around how species might come about, what's referred to as a speciation event. And I'll use Darwin's finches, in part because Darwin gave a lot of attention to this question of speciation, or at least was very interested in it. And what's interesting about his finches that he studied or originally introduced in terms of his collection during the voyage of the Beagle is that since then, scientists have looked specifically at the finches of the Galapagos and shown quite clearly evolution in action. So many people ask me, well, are we still evolving? Does evolution stop? And the answer is no, it doesn't stop. We all carry on evolving, whether it's in developing immune systems better to fight new variants on the flu virus or whatever. We are all actively evolving all the time, and all organisms are. And that's what this study of these many different generations, there's been people who have studied the finches for over decades. And so the first thing that you can notice with a finch is the size of its beak. So we'll just use that as a particular trait of a finch. There are other aspects of being a finch besides having a bill and how big it is. But that's one thing that can be measured and can be related to their diet. So for certain types of food, you need a bigger beak than for others. So what they found in the Galapagos study of the finches, Darwin's finches, so-called Darwin's finches, is that they have what they observed to be oscillating selection. And what that means is that over time, sometimes the islands would be quite wet, other times they'd be quite dry, or there'd be something in between. And during dry climates, the certain bill depth was favored, and during wet climates, the other one, in relation to the sorts of plants that grew under those rainfall regimes and the types of seeds or food that the bird could eat. So the consequence of this is, over the long term, or at least as long as these studies have gone on, which, as I mentioned, have been for, I think, almost up to 4 decades now, there's no long-term change. But every generation, there's shifts, or there might be a trend towards one decade that goes back than the next decade. And that's referred to as oscillating because there's no directional change over the time of observations. It's simply oscillating about a mean. But of course, those birds, those beaks, are continually changing in response to the environments to which they're adapted. The other possibility, though, could be that if you have an island with a windward and leeward side, a wet and dry, you could have an original population. The one specializes for the wet side and the other for the dry. They live on the same island, but they don't have sex together. They keep their separate ways. And they then evolve separately. The one evolves for the dry climate, the other for the wet. And that way you can take an original species that maybe arrives at that island from the main continent, and it ends up splitting into two species, the one adapted for the wet and the other for the dry. So that's another option to how to create two species out of one. And then what we mentioned yesterday was this idea of directional selection, and we referred to it in terms of the human brain within our lineage. And that seems to be a good example, I believe, of directional selection for a bigger brain as these climatic fluctuations put us under pressure to use a bigger brain to come up with solutions to life's problems. So in this case, what happens is, suppose we have a wet climate initially, but it becomes increasingly dry over a long-term trend. Then what can happen is the one species designed for wet climates gradually gets displaced by the one that's adapted to dry. Or it could happen the other way around. But those are some of the ideas around how it's possible that different species could evolve from a starting point. Now, an important concept that I want to make a specific focus on is what's referred to as allopatric speciation, sometimes referred to as a vicariance. Allo means elsewhere, and patric means country, so it means outside of the country speciation. And what that means is that if you have a large piece of land, say, with an organism living on it, and that you have, say, a rise in sea level that creates a bridge. This could be the Cape Peninsula, for example, and this could be if the ice on Antarctica melts. That could be the Cape Flats being flooded, and that could be the Cape Peninsula, which would now become an island. So the idea is that if you physically isolate a group on a island, or this, instead of a seaway, this could be a desert, you have some sort of a barrier that gets established that is a good enough barrier that the individuals on this small island cannot intermingle with those on the large island. And what these different colors represent is the amount of genetic diversity within each of those populations. And the large landmass will have a large diversity of different types of DNA, but those that get isolated will only be a small portion of that bigger population. And so you get what's called the founder effect, where you lose, like here we've lost the red, and you lose some genetic variation. Then over time, if that small island population remains isolated, over time it can evolve fairly quickly to develop, say, a new trait of orange, and greatly reduce, say, another trait like yellow to the point where it's eliminated. And in that way, through this isolation and over time, the one smaller population can diverge away from the mainland. And that's believed to be a very important mechanism by which new species can come about, particularly if life on this isolated island is quite different to what's going on the mainland, so that the selective pressures are different, then you're likely to end up with perhaps a new species over enough time. Now, the new species that evolves over time, suppose this barrier now goes away, suppose the ice sheets build up again, sea levels lowered, and this new group now, or this slightly different group, reconnects. Well, of course, they can then intermingle again. And that's what often happens. And that's another important process in evolution, because that's how you end up with hybrids. So hybridization, and I just show you an example here of a zorse, okay, which is a cross between a horse and a zebra. Now, it's an artificial hybrid because horses and zebras would normally never meet naturally. But if they're encouraged by humans, then they can crossbreed. And horses and zebras are close enough genetically that they can have viable offspring. And so one of the important issues around this geographical model of isolation is often the isolated group will reconnect with the original group at some later time. And they can then mix their genetic material, and you end up with what's called a hybrid. And that hybrid can be more successful than either of the two were originally or not. That just has to play out with time. So depending on the time since their separation, isolated populations can successfully interbreed. And that will be important for us, that concept of hybridization, because in tomorrow's lecture, we'll see that when Homo sapiens do leave Africa, they do successfully intermingle with Neanderthals and Denisovans, the two major groups in Eurasia at that time. And they have viable offspring, so that all of you in here have a certain percentage of your DNA derived from Neanderthals and from Denisovans. Not very much, but some. And I'll talk more specifically to that tomorrow. But for now, the Homo sapiens haven't left. So we're still in Africa, but within Africa, isolated groups could still intermingle. So let's look at the following conceptual idea around, here's Africa during a glacial. Remember, this is a world we're unfamiliar with. It's when the northern hemisphere ice sheets covered much of North America and northern Eurasia. And sea level was lower. That's shown by this black outline here of the exposed continent that would result from this lowered sea level. And what we can see in a glacial period, that certain areas like North Africa, South Africa, parts of the Great Lakes, the Ethiopian highlands, and perhaps other areas may have become isolated enough from the rest of the African population to have been geographically isolated populations that may have diverged to some extent from other groups. Then importantly, during the switchover from glacials to interglacials, remember we have that brief period of greening of the Sahara where we have grassland and lakes instead of sand. And in that case, during those periods, these populations that were previously isolated could then expand. And they could intermingle with one another during that expansion. So we don't really know how many of these isolated groups there may have been, but conceptually you could imagine that there might have been a fair number of them, and that they might have been isolated to variable amounts for variable periods of time. But some of them, as I'll argue here, particularly those in the north and south, were probably isolated for much of those glacial interglacial cycles, so on the order of 80 to 100,000 years. And that's quite a few 25-year human generations in which divergence could have occurred. So let's take a closer look then. Okay, and then what happens, of course, is now you've mixed everyone together again as populations disperse, but then you go back to another glacial and you isolate other groups again, and then you mix them and you isolate and you mix. So in other words, it was an acceleration. I think this was a mechanism to accelerate evolution because it allowed for a large amount of isolated populations that could diverge from other groups, become genetically distinct, and then also to allow those to mix together later, and those that were fittest would carry on. Now, if we want to think about the area that's perhaps the most isolated in Africa, it's hard to beat the Maghreb, which is this section here. Do you see in this satellite photo, these are the Atlas Mountains, and this is Morocco and Algeria, and you can see this green patch here of a Mediterranean climate along the coast of Mediterranean. Now, even when we had the glacial maximum, the Strait of Gibraltar was still there. And there was no passage over to Sicily. This was still a seaway. The only land bridge throughout the glacial and interglacial cycles was the Sinai Peninsula. Of course, the Suez Canal wasn't cut yet, of course. So that was the only real land bridge that tethered the African continent to the Eurasian continent. And so this area here would have become isolated from the fact that you had the Mediterranean Sea separating it from Eurasia, and you had this huge Sahara Desert that separated it from the rest of the sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a very good possibility of a location that may have been isolated during these climatic shifts. And then also just remember, we had these brief periods where the Sahara greened, so then people living there could exchange with sub-Saharan Africans. Other places, so that's, and we know from the archaeological record that the Maghreb has numbered 1 through 14, 15, well, these are outside of it, but these, you can see there's a large number of archaeological sites on that coast that go back at least about 1 million years. So we know that that was occupied by our ancestors throughout the past. This is, of course, the East African Rift Valley, which has a very rich archaeological record, and also is an area where you may have had isolation around certain lakes. And then, of course, South Africa, Southern Africa, also very rich in archaeological sites. And one of the areas that I want to focus on now is this southern tip of Africa as a possible area of isolation as well. And that relates back a bit to this, now it's in white, but you see this white rim around here. That's showing you how much of the African continent was exposed when the ice was at its maximum extent. And what I'll just point out, and I'll show you in more detail now, is the large amount of shelf area on the Angolas Bank that becomes exposed during the glacials. You also get a fair large shelf area off Mozambique. You get one off Eritrea, off Tunisia, and off of Morocco and Northwest Africa here, West Africa. But what I would argue is that for this one, people could expand out onto the shelf and then back, with the Sahara acting as a barrier. And in South Africa, they could expand onto that shelf and then back. But in this case, I'll argue that the Cape Fold Belt Mountains acted as a potential barrier. The problem with these other coastal regions with expansion of the coastal plain is these other ones do not have interior barriers. It's just open. There's nothing to prevent people from expanding and contracting along these coastal regions. So what I'm arguing here is that the northernmost tip, the Maghreb, and the southern tip of South Africa were particularly important, perhaps, in terms of geographical isolation, because they were impacted by the climate change, but they were also impacted by this fluctuation in the size of the coastal plain. And most importantly, they were isolated. There was a barrier from which populations there could be isolated. Okay, and this, I won't dwell on this. This is just to remind you of these. This is the sea level, which goes with the climate cycles. And that the idea is, if we take a cross-section of the coast, the idea is during an interglacial like today, sea level's up here, and our coastal plain is shown here in black. But when you have a glacial, sea level drops 130 meters, that's vertically. If you have a shallow coastal plain shelf, that's a lot of kilometers, potentially, to where the shoreline moves offshore. So the idea is that these cycles correspond to the exposure and then flooding, exposure, flooding, over and over again on these cycles of time related to these glacial interglacial events. So let's look closer to home. This is southern Africa. This is the topography. There's the Great Escarpment. Here's the Great Karoo. Here's the Kleine Karoo. And the Cape Fold Belt Mountains form this Cedarburg through here and then across as a series of mountain ranges over to Port Elizabeth area. And it defines this coastal plain in the west, the western coastal plain. Here's Cape Town. And it defines this southern coastal plain. And that's the focus that I want to have, because you can see that during the glacial, the shoreline goes all the way out here to this light blue line here to 120. So you can see how much bigger this coastal plain expands by during a glacial period. And importantly, it diverts then. You can easily walk around to Cape Town through what would then be the False Bay Valley, not the False Bay Bay, because that would all be exposed. So that's the idea, is that this coastal plain expands so great that the rivers, the Breeder River would have flowed like this, the Choretz River, maybe something like that, and then all the rivers flowing off of the Cape Fold Belts would have flowed across there. So the idea then is people could have expanded onto this area, and conversely, when the ice melts, the sea level is going to rise, and it rises quite rapidly because the ice melts quite rapidly, and this strand line is going to rapidly retreat back to where it is today. And in that process, you can imagine all the animals, all the people are going to be shoved up against a barrier, which in this case is the Cape Fold Belt Mountains, and they're going to be in a situation of higher population density, and that's going to in turn demand that they come up with innovative ways of how to survive. So many of you will have hopefully driven along the N2. You get beautiful landscapes like this of the underlying Bokefeld or Malmesbury Shale, which grows the lovely cannoli fields and wheat and so forth. And they're very fertile land. You can just imagine herds of wildebeest and herds of wonderful tasting animals across those coastal plains. And they certainly existed. And then they run up against this very steep, dramatic mountains. They're not particularly high, the Cape Fold Belt, maybe up to around 2,000, 2,300 meters, but they're incredibly rugged mountains for any of you who've driven over some of the spectacular mountain passes. So that the mountains, I argue, act as a fairly good barrier, not an absolute barrier, but a fairly good barrier at keeping animals and people trapped on the coastal plain. There are, of course, mountain passes, but if you've ever driven any of them, they're beautiful passes to drive. Here's the Otaniqua Pass. But, you know, if you didn't have a car with a cut road, that would not be an easy pass to go through. It's a very steep pass. The valleys are extremely steep-walled, very difficult to negotiate. Plus, the vegetation that grows in these mountain passes areas is, of course, the famous feinboss. But it consists of proteas, ericas, and restios, which are not particularly edible, okay? You can eat the corms of the geophytes, as I mentioned the other day, but that's one reason why not a lot of grazers are up here. They're all down on the plain with the fertile, grassy, deriving soils of the coastal plain. You know, this would be very difficult plant to forage on, and not very many animals do. So there wouldn't be much to eat along the way. So this is a little bit involved. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I just want to point out that this is relating to the cycles that I mentioned. Coastal plain expands, populations can move out on it. Populations from the interior can work their way around it, the mountains. But when the ice melts and this contracts, for those who don't get out, they are then basically entrapped on this relatively small coastal plain. And that's how I argue that this particular geographical location was perhaps important by these very large changes in population densities on the south coast. But what about the whole interior of Africa? What about that? That's huge, right? You've got the East African Rift system shown here. So these are the East African rifts with these lovely lakes and river systems. You have the Ethiopian highlands. There's a photograph here located in Ethiopia. And those were definitely probably refugia for humans at the time during glacials, because the Ethiopian highlands would have stayed wetter. There would have been more food there. People probably would have ended up there perhaps in somewhat in isolation. Also around some of these lakes, if they didn't dry out, they could have found refuge around those. So no question that there were areas within all of Africa, besides, it wasn't just the Maghreb and the southern Africa, but also within the interior, there were probably many areas that were at least partially isolated. But the reason why I want to emphasize why I think the northern tip and the southern tip were so critical in terms of the engine rooms of evolution is that the problem with the rest of Africa basically, is that you simply had too much climate variability that could relax those barriers. So you can get an appreciation for that by looking at a modern population density map of Africa. And what I just want to emphasize is you can see these trends in terms of population density around lakes, Ethiopian highlands, and many of these are centered around riverways and other aspects. And you can see that for some place like the Maghreb, that's really isolated from the rest of Africa. Now today, of course, you can cross this with camels or whatever, but in the past, that I would argue, would be just too formidable a barrier for at least not very much exchange between those populations. And the problem with these interior ones is that it wouldn't take much relaxation in climate to reestablish river courses, maybe reestablish lakes, that would have allowed people to exchange populations and intermix. Whereas I would argue that the southern coastal plain with the Cape Fold Bear Mountains and the Sahara were far more substantial. They weren't absolute barriers, but they were far more substantial barriers that may have inhibited movement by those groups. But clearly, Central Africa still played a role, no question about that, and that groups were continuing to evolve both in well-connected areas and isolated areas, and that as we cycle through these glacial, interglacial cycles, that would suggest, as I alluded to earlier around hybridization, that speciation was probably incredibly complex. Because you had these 100,000-year cycles of glacial to interglacials, populations being variably isolated and then remixing. And I think that led to, and hybridization would have definitely been a feature of those populations as they remixed. So I think what we can say about our speciation is it was undoubtedly very complex and involved these various populations that were at times isolated and then remixed. So this comes to the next part of this talk, which is the question then, what may have driven the divergence of those isolated populations away from those living elsewhere? So in other words, okay, you can isolate a population, but remember I said that it's particularly effective if the conditions for that isolated group are very different to the group that's left behind. And one interesting feature of our speciation event is that it doesn't appear to be associated with innovative tools to extract more food calories. As we saw in the case of Homo erectus, remember I proposed that perhaps the control of fire was fundamental in the speciation of Homo erectus. Homo heidelbergensis was perhaps the development of a thrusting spear, and our predecessor, the development of the javelin spear and the use of ochre. So those would have been specific behavioral or innovative tools that would have allowed for greater capture of calories to allow for their larger brain and evolution away from earlier species. But how can we explain Homo sapiens if we don't see in the archaeological record any real major innovative tool for extracting more food from the environment? And that's what I said yesterday, in the end of yesterday, is I claimed that that difference was the discovery and exploitation of seafood. And why was that important? It was important because, as they say, you are what you eat, more or less. So if we look at our close relatives, the gorillas, for example, and the chimps, gorillas eat lots and lots of leaves. And inadvertently, there's an insect in those leaves, and I guess they get some protein from that. But basically, they eat a lot of leaves. And they eat leaves all day long, and they're big animals with big stomachs. So they have a large diet of low-caloric foods, but very plentiful. Chimps also eat some leaves, but they mostly eat fruit, which are higher in obviously sugar and other features, so they eat a lot of fruit. They also, of course, as we saw, they pound nuts with stones. And they will occasionally hunt a monkey or a buck, bush buck, and they'll eat meat, but only recently killed fresh meat, and not very often. But as we saw with the Australopiths, they had a diet largely probably reflective of similar, probably to a large extent with chimpanzees, but then that our lineage Homo became far more diverse in its diet. It had a more omnivorous diet, including meat, fat, aquatic foods, cooked foods, etc. And that many of these, meat and fat and aquatic foods, they are much more high-calorie foods. And that's really important if you want to grow a big brain, because a big brain takes about 20% of all the calories you eat. It's very expensive to run your brain from a calorie point of view. And the point about seafood is that it represents kind of the ideal food. Now, prior to seafood, a lot of nutritious food came from, say, aquatic systems like the Okavango Delta, the papyrus and the papyrus culms, the eating of catfish, so forth. A lot of highly nutritious food can be obtained in the terrestrial system, no question about that. But already by 2 million years ago, our lineage was making full advantage of these systems. So if you think about it, if you were going to have to go out there in the wild and get enough food to fill yourself, you would be hard-pressed to let up anything that couldn't be eaten and digested, right? So my argument is that by the time of our predecessor, we had become extremely knowledgeable and capable of exploiting almost every known terrestrial food source. Grubs, insects, plants, freshwater fish, freshwater clams, you name it. Anything that was edible would have certainly been exploited, simply because we need a lot of calories to live. So the critical thing about seafood, and why I think it was so important as an inclusion, is that it represents a novel, in other words, never before utilized food source that is very high in calories, and it is ideal in terms of human health, in terms of the development and growth of our brain, our nervous system, and our eyesight. And that's because it's a very rich source of protein and fat, and it's the good fats, right? It's all those omega fatty acids that are absolutely critical, particularly for growing fetus and young children. Vitamin A and B12, iodine, zinc, iron, etc. So shellfish, beach seals, limpets, you name it. If it's at the shore, it came from the sea, it's really good for you. It's really good for people to eat. And as an example of one of those trace nutrients, iodine, mentioned here. I'll just give an example of iodine. Today, it's estimated that almost 2 billion people globally are at risk of iodine deficiency, with 38 million newborns every year in developing countries susceptible to lifelong loss of learning ability from too little iodine. That surprised me when I read it. That's based on a UNICEF study. So iodine is very important to human health, and many people today don't get enough. And that's, of course, why they iodize salt, table salt, so that people love salt, they'll eat more, they'll get more iodine if they iodize it. And that was a thing that many governments did in the 50s. And this is after the iodization of salt. Okay? Still a lot of people are iodine deficient. And this is some of the problems with iodine deficiency is cretinism and goiter and just poor development in general. So I just make the point about iodine to point out that some of these trace elements are extremely important for human health. And iodine is very abundant in marine foods, far less so in terrestrial foods. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it's at far less concentrations than in marine foods. So it argues that our need for iodine makes our speciation in a low iodine region, like continental interior, seem unlikely. It seems more likely that our dependency on it as a micronutrient would reflect if that was in fact how we came to evolve on, say, a marine diet. Does this mean people couldn't live outside the coast? Not at all. People could definitely move away from the coast as Homo sapiens, but like today, they were probably iodine deficient. But that probably didn't bother them, you know? It probably wasn't, in other words, it didn't kill them. It maybe made them have certain, struggle with certain aspects of living, but it didn't kill them. As with many of these deficiencies, they're not enough to necessarily kill you, but they will lower your optimal health. So certainly it didn't prevent people from living outside of the coast. It doesn't mean you have to eat seafood either. Many people don't like seafood. But because if you have evolved from a speciation event that involved the eating of seafood, doesn't mean that you, as that species, have to carry on eating it. As long as you get the required nutrients in the food that you do eat, you should be fine. But as I mentioned, many people don't get enough iodine. So the coast also represents a real richness of food. I mean, imagine finding one beached whale. There's a tremendous amount of food in one beached whale that you're going to have to hunt down a heck of a lot of antelope before you're going to get anywhere near that amount of fatty, omega-rich protein. That's just a gold mine for the first strandlopers who learned how and appreciated the exploitation of whales. And if you think beached whales are relatively uncommon today, just bear in mind that the whale population has been decimated, okay? So whaling has basically cleared out the oceans of whales, more or less. They have recovered to some extent, but the whale population was decimated in the 1910 to 1970s. And so you could imagine, as in the past with seal colonies, this is the Cape Cross colony in Namibia, those were probably much bigger and much more abundant before the fur sail traders came and wiped them out. So the idea is that beached whales and beached seals would probably have been far more common with these very large populations nearby. Also, going to the beach is a lot less dangerous than going to the normal wetland areas. Remember I said the wetland areas had these wonderful papyrus, water lilies, all sorts of catfish, all sorts of things that are good for you, but you've got to watch out for crocodiles. You got to, if modern statistics are anything to go by, most people today die from being trampled by hippos. The hippos don't intentionally trample them. It's just that it's at night and they're in their way and between their feeding ground and their water. So people die by trampling. And of course, there were lions and other big cats. Most of these animals did not hang around beaches. It wasn't part of their environment. So if that's the case, then why wasn't seafood exploited much earlier? Why did it take so long before people started to exploit it? Well, as much as we appreciate beautiful beaches, and many of us long to live there, probably our ancestors didn't want to live there. Too harsh, too exposed to the sun, and on face value, it doesn't look like it has a lot going for it, especially in terms of fresh water. Which, more than food, the primary thing we need is fresh water. That would always be first. So that was probably one of the big drawbacks to doing it. The other thing was there might have been an aversion to chowing down on a piece of fresh limpet. And this is a quote from Jonathan Swift. He was a bold man that first ate an oyster. We had to overcome any reluctance from what might be considered kind of disgusting looking or gelatinous sort of food. But once you got used to it, or if you were hungry enough, you got used to it. Many of us, of course, love seafood. The other key thing about the South Coast and this idea is that not only was it an area of isolation, it has a coastline that's incredibly rich in seafood. The limpet densities and the abalone density, all these food groups are incredibly rich along the South Coast today, and that's after they've been exploited. The other key advantage, as I mentioned, is water, and if you look at a place like Sedgefield, we have these coastal lake systems, flays. Some of them are brackish from tidal exchange, but other parts are relatively fresh. And if you look at the South Coast, it's intersected by a large number of freshwater systems. And you can see there's Blombos Cave, right on the coast, present-day coast, and there's Pinnacle Point Cave. And this is the box here, is this image here of the Sedgefield coast. And there's the Cape Fold Belt in the distance. So this abundance of fresh water near the coast was very critical. Now, if that's true, then we should expect that consuming marine resources would have coincided with our speciation. So far, the earliest evidence of a marine diet is from the Pinnacle Point Caves, as I mentioned, right here on the south coast near the Goritz River mouth. There they are there, the caves, and they're right near intertidal sources of the brown perinaparina mussel. And they also have within them, not whales' bones, but they have a barnacle fossil that's only living on whales. So the implication is people cut off pieces of whale blubber meat, took it back to the cave, and the only thing that's remained as a fossil is the little barnacle that grew only on those whales, which is pretty conclusive. So the combination then of those aspects suggests that this periodic isolation, if you isolated a group on the south coast during this glacial low stand here and before our species appeared, they would have had 20 to 80,000 years or 800 to 3,200 25-year generations as an isolated group that was eating seafood and nobody else was. And over that sort of a time frame of this many generations, it's conceivable that they evolved into us, Homo sapiens. And they would have had brains, and they would have had eyesight, and they would have nervous systems that were optimally developed from at least a steady incorporation of marine diet. So to summarize, I'll just, sorry this is all in words, but I'll just run through this, and that is that it's consistent with the importance of dietary changes in the evolution of our lineage as a whole, okay? And that is where we see major speciation events, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, our own species. They are usually associated with a new dietary source, and that's either achieved through fire and cooking food, or it's achieved through better tools and weapons to bring down game, or in our case, it might have just been by discovering seafood. How easy was that? And then the southern coastal plain is a plausible region for where that might have happened.